Hi guys, welcome to the channel of Love Study Time. We're reading How to Raise Your Own Salary by Napoleon Hill. We're on chapter 5, Go the Extra Mile. Okay. Early one frosty morning, the private railroad car of Charles M. Swab was shifted to the sidetrack at his steel plant in Pennsylvania. As he left the car, he was met by a young man who explained that he was a stenographer in the office of the steel company, and he had met the car with the hope that he might be of some service to Mr. Swab. "Who requested you to meet me here?" Swab asked. "It was my own idea, sir," the young man replied, "and I knew you were coming on the early morning train because I handled a telegram that stated you were coming. I brought my notebook with me, sir, and I'll be glad to take any letters or telegrams you may wish to send." Mr. Swab thanked the young man for his thoughtfulness, but said he needed no service at the moment, although he might send for the lad later in the day. And he did. When the private car returned to New York that night, it carried that young man back to the city where he had been assigned at Mr. Swab's request for duty in the steel magnate's private office. The young man's name was Williams. We do not recall his first name, but that is unimportant. What we do recall is the fact that Mr. Williams promoted himself from one job to another in the steel organisation until he earned and saved enough money to enable him to go into business for himself, and he later founded a drug company of which he became the president and majority stockholder. Nothing very dramatic or interesting about this brief story, is there? Well, the answer depends altogether upon what one calls drama. To every man who is trying to find his place in the world, this story, if analysed carefully, carries the deepest sort of drama, for it describes the practical application of one of the more important of the 17 principles of individual achievement, the habit of going the extra mile. We said that this young man Williams promoted himself from one job to another in the steel company. Let us find out how he managed this self-promotion in order that we may learn how others can profit by his technique. Let us learn, if we can, what young Williams had in the way of ability which other stenographers in the general plant operation office of the steel company did not have, that caused him to be singled out by Mr. Swab and assigned to his personal service. We have Mr. Swab's own word that young Williams did not possess a single quality that entitled him to rate above the average as a stenographer, but he did have one quality, a quality that he developed on his own initiative and practised as an inviolable habit which but few people possess, and that was the habit of rendering more service and better service than he was paid for. It was this habit that enabled him to promote himself. It was this habit that attracted the attention of Mr. Swab. It was this habit that helped him to become the head of a corporation where he became also his own boss. And it was this habit, as we shall soon see from Andrew Carnegie's analysis of the subject in this chapter, which many years previous to the incident here related, brought Mr. Swab himself to the attention of Mr. Carnegie and gained for him his opportunity to promote himself into a position in which he became his own boss. It was also this same habit that enabled the irrepressible Carnegie to rise from the position of day labourer to that of the owner of America's largest industry, where he accumulated a vast fortune in money and a still greater fortune in useful knowledge, which is now available to the people of America who have the vision and the ambition to appropriate and use it. Mr. Carnegie's views on the subject of going the extra mile provide the students of this philosophy with a practical working technique with which they may use this principle effectively for their own self-promotion. His analysis of the subject is here, presented in his own words. Hill. Mr. Carnegie, I have heard some men express the belief that success often is a result of luck. Many people seem to believe that successful men achieve their success because they get favourable breaks of life, and that others fail because they get the unfavourable breaks. Croesus, the wealthy Persian philosopher, made some such reference to chance when he said, "There is a wheel on which the affairs of man revolve, and its mechanism is such that it prevents any man from being always fortunate." Have you, in the richness of your business experience, seen any evidence of such a will? Do you attribute any portion of your success to luck or favourable breaks? Carnegie, your questions give me a suitable starting point for an appropriate description of the fifth of the 17 principles of achievement. Let us call it the habit of going the extra mile, by which I mean the habit of rendering more service and better service than one is paid for. First, I will answer your question by saying yes, indeed, there is a wheel of life which controls human destinies, and I am happy to be able to tell you that this will can be definitely influenced to operate in one's favour. If this were not true, there would be no object in organising the rules of personal achievement. Hill, will you tell me, in the simplest words possible, just how one may control this wheel of fortune? I would like a description of this important success factor, which the young man or young woman just beginning a business career may understand. Carnegie, first of all, to control the wheel of fortune, one must understand, master, and apply the 17 principles of achievement. I have already named 5 of these principles, and I might here suggest that these 5, if properly applied, will carry one a long way on the road towards success in any calling. Hill, am I to understand that the 5 principles of definiteness of purpose, the mastermind, attractive personality, applied faith, and going the extra mile are sufficient to ensure one's success? Carnegie, no, one cannot depend upon these 5 principles alone. There are 12 other principles of achievement which I have not yet mentioned, and you will observe, when I explain them, that they provide contributory knowledge needed in the attainment of success that one may not acquire from the 5 principles I have already named. The 5 principles are sufficient to enable a man to establish a definite goal in life and determine approximately the amount of wealth he intends to accumulate, what he intends to give in return for that wealth, and so relate himself to other people that they will not place unnecessary obstacles in his way. But one has a considerable distance to travel beyond this point before he attains enduring success by writing his own price tag, as the master of the entire 17 principles may do. Hill, do you mean to say that there are definite rules of procedure through which a person may literally write his own price tag and be sure of getting it? Surely I must have misunderstood you, because it seems to me that if such rules do exist, there would not be so many poverty-stricken people in the world, especially in view of the fact that we, in America, are surrounded with an abundance of every form of wealth and gifted with the freedom of initiative to choose our own occupation and live our own lives as we choose. Carnegie, yes, you understand me correctly, and I will describe the particular rule of success which will, if properly applied, enable a person literally to write his own price tag with more than an average chance of getting that which he desires. Moreover, this rule is so potent that it practically ensures one against serious opposition from those who purchase his services. As I have already stated, this rule is known as the habit of going the extra mile, which means the habit of doing more than one is paid to do. You will observe that I have injected an important word into the description of this rule, the word habit. Before the application of the rule begins to bring back appreciable results, it must become a habit, and it must be applied at all times in all possible ways. It means that one must render the greatest amount of service of which he is capable, and he must render it in a friendly, harmonious, mental manner. Moreover, he must do this regardless of the amount of the immediate compensation he receives, even if he receives no immediate compensation whatsoever. Hill. But Mr. Carnegie, most of the people I know, those who work for wages or a salary, claim that they are already doing more work than that for which they are paid. If this is true, why aren't they doing a better job of influencing the wheel of fortune in their behalf than they appear to be doing? Why aren't they rich, as you are? Carnegie. The answer to your question is simple enough, but it has many angles I shall have to explain before you'll understand it. In the first place, if you will accurately analyse those who work for wages, you will learn that 98 out of every 100 have no definite major purpose greater than that of working for a daily wage. Therefore, no matter how much work they do, or how well they do it, the wheel of fortune will turn on past them without providing more than a bare living, because they neither expect nor demand more. Ponder over this truth for a moment, and you will be better prepared to follow the logic I will present in the remainder of this lesson. The major difference between those who accept limitation of daily wages sufficient only for a bare living and myself is this. I demand riches in definite terms. I have a definite plan for acquiring riches. I am engaged in carrying out my plan, and I am given an equivalent in useful service of the value of those riches I demand, while the others have no such plan or purpose. Life is paying me off on my own terms. It is doing precisely the same thing for the man who seeks no more than daily wages. You see, the wheel of fortune follows the mental blueprint that a man sets up in his own mind, and it brings back to him, in physical or financial measure, an exact equivalent of that blueprint. Unless you grasp the full meaning of this statement of truth, you will miss the important portion of this lesson. There is a law of compensation, through the operation of which a man may establish his own relationship with life, including the material possessions he accumulates. There is no escape from the acceptance of the reality of this law, for it is not a man-made law. Hill. I can understand your viewpoint, Mr. Carnegie. Stating the matter in another way, may we not say that every man is where he is and what he is because of the use he makes of his own mind? Carnegie, you have stated the idea correctly. The major difficulty of most men who go through life poverty-stricken is that they neither recognise the power of their own minds nor make any attempt to take possession of their minds. That which a man can accomplish with his hands seldom brings more than a mere living. That which a man can accomplish through the use of his mind may give him whatever he asks of life. Now let us get on with our analysis of the principle of going the extra mile. I am going to explain some of the more practical advantages of this principle. I call them practical because they are benefits of which anyone may avail themselves without the consent of others. Let us consider first the fact that the habit of doing more than one is paid for brings one to the favourable attention of those who have opportunities to offer. I have never yet known of any man promoting himself to a higher and more profitable position without adopting and following this habit. The habit aids one, in developing and maintaining the right mental attitude towards others, thereby serving as an effective means of gaining friendly cooperation. It helps one to profit by the law of contrast, since obviously a majority of the people follow the exact opposite of this principle by doing just as little work as they can get by with, and that is about all they are getting, just getting by. It creates a continuous market for one's services. Moreover, it ensures one a choice of jobs and working conditions at the top of the scale of wages or other forms of compensation. It attracts opportunities which are not available to those who render as little service as possible and thereby serves as an effective medium for self-promotion from wage earning to business ownership. Under some circumstances, it enables one to become indispensable in his job, thereby paving the way for him to name his own compensation. It aids one in the development of self-reliance. Most important of all its benefits, it gives one the advantage of the law of increasing returns, through which he will eventually receive compensation far beyond the actual market value of the service he renders. Therefore, the habit of doing more than one is paid for is a sound business principle, even if it is used purely as a measure of expediency to promote one personal interest advantageously. The habit of doing more than one is paid for is one that an individual may practice without asking the permission of others. Therefore, it is under one's own control. Many other beneficial habits can be practiced only through the consent and cooperation of other people. Hill. Mr. Carnegie, do all men who work for you have your permission to render more service and better service than that for which they are paid? And if so, how many are taking advantage of this privilege in a manner that is beneficial to themselves? Carnegie. I'm glad you asked that question because it gives me an opportunity to drive home an important viewpoint on this subject. First, let me say that every person working for me, and this applies with equal truth to all who have worked for me in the past, not only has the privilege of doing more than he is being paid for, but I encourage all who work for me to do this very thing for their benefit as well as my own. It may surprise you to hear that of the many thousands of men who work for me, but a very small number have taken the trouble to place me under obligations to them by rendering more service and better service than that for which they are paid. Among the few exceptions are the members of my mastermind group, every man whom practices the habit as definitely as he eats his meals. There are others among our supervisory and managerial groups who practice the habit of doing more than they are paid for, and every one of them is receiving compensation far greater than that received by the majority of our workers, although every man in my employ has the privilege of rendering this sort of service without asking the consent of anyone. As I have told you previously, some of the members of my mastermind group, such men as Charlie Swab, have made themselves so definitely indispensable to our business that they have earned as much as $1 million in 1 year over and above their fixed salaries. Not a few of the men who have thus promoted themselves into the higher brackets of income in our organisation have attracted opportunities to go into business for themselves. Hill. Couldn't you have driven a better bargain with those to whom you paid as much as $1 million a year in extra compensation? Carnegie. Oh, to be sure I could have had their services for much less money. But you... Okay, let me just repeat that, guys. Carnegie. Oh, to be sure I could have had their services for much less money, but you must remember that this principle of doing more than one is paid for operates in favour of an employer just as the same as it operates for the benefit of the employee. Excuse me. Therefore, it is just as much an act of wisdom for an employer to pay a man all he earns as it is for an employee to endeavour to earn more than he receives. By paying Charlie Swab all he earned, I thereby insured myself against the loss of his services. Hill, you speak of paying your men who render more service than they are paid for all they earn. If you do that, how can they render more service than they are paid for? It seems that there is an inconsistency in your statement. Carnegie, that which you mistake for inconsistency is only the mistake of many others on this subject, and is due to a lack of understanding of the habit of going the extra mile. The apparent inconsistency is therefore an illusion, but I will set you right on this subject. It is a fact that I pay my men all they earn, even though I sometimes have to pay them huge sums. But there is one important point you have overlooked. It is the fact that before I begin paying them all they earn, they must establish their indispensability by doing more than they are paid for. Now, here is the fine point that most people overlook. Until a man begins to render more service than that for which he is paid, he is not entitled to more pay than he receives for that service, since obviously he is already receiving full pay for what he does. I think I can make the point clear by calling attention to the simple illustration of the farmer. Before he collects pay for his services, he carefully and intelligently prepares the soil, ploughs and harrows it, fertilises it if need be, then plants it with seed. Up to this point he has gained nothing whatsoever for his labour, but, understanding the law of growth as he does, he rests after his labour while nature germinates the seed and yields him a crop. Here the element of time enters into the farmer's labour. In due time nature gives him back the seed he planted in the ground, together with an abundant overplus to compensate him for his labour and his knowledge. If he sows a bushel of wheat in properly prepared soil, he gets back the bushel of seed together with perhaps as many as 10 additional bushels as his compensation. Here the law of increasing returns has stepped in and compensated the farmer for his labour and his intelligence. If there were no such law, man could not exist on this earth, since obviously there would be no object in planting a bushel of wheat in the ground if nature yielded back only a bushel of grain. It is this overplus which nature yields, through the law of increasing returns, that makes it possible for a man to produce from the ground the food needed for both man and beast. But little imagination is needed to see that the man who renders more service and better service than that for which he is paid thereby places himself in a position to benefit by this same law. If a man rendered only as much service as he is paid to render, then he would have no logical reason to expect or demand more than the fair value of that service. One of the evils of today is the attempt, on the part of some, to reverse this rule and collect more pay than the value of service they render. Some men endeavour to force down the hours of labour and boost up the rate of pay. This practice cannot be pursued indefinitely. When men continue to collect more for their labour than the value of their services, they ultimately exhaust the source of their own wages, and the sheriff makes the next move. I want you to understand this point clearly, because lack of knowledge on this subject is destined to bring ruin to the American system of industry if the practice of endeavouring to secure more for labour than one puts into it is not corrected. The man to do the correcting is the man who depends upon his labour for a living, for he is the only man who has the privilege of initiative in the correction of this unsound practice. Please do not misunderstand me to be speaking disparagingly, I don't know how you say that word. Okay. of the man who earns his living from daily labour. For the truth is that I am endeavouring to aid the labouring man by giving him a sounder philosophy of relationship in connection with the marketing of his services. Hill. Then you believe it to be just as unwise for an employer to withhold from an employee any portion of the wages he had justly earned, as it would be for an employee to set a handicap for himself by doing less than he is paid to do. As I reach the conclusion from what you have said, that your reasoning on this entire subject is based on your understanding of sound economics and the principle of increasing returns. Carnegie. You have grasped the idea perfectly, and allow me to congratulate you, because most people never seem to understand the great potential benefits available to those who follow the habit of rendering more service than for what they are paid. Often I have heard working men say, I'm not paid to do that, or that is not my responsibility, and I'll be blankety blankety blank if I do anything I'm not paid for. You've heard statements like that. Everyone has. Well, when you hear a man talking like this, you may mark him down as one who will never get more than a bare living from his work. Moreover, that sort of mental attitude makes one disliked by his associates, and it therefore discourages favourable opportunities for self-promotion. When I go in search of a man to fill a responsible position, the very first quality I look for is that of a positive, agreeable mental attitude. You may wonder why I do not look first for ability to do the work I want done. I'll tell you why. The man with a negative mental attitude will disturb the harmony of relationship of all with whom he works. Therefore, he is a disintegrating influence with no effective manager, which no effective manager wants to deal with. I look first for the right mental attitude, because where this is found, one generally finds along with it a willingness to learn. Then the ability necessary to do a certain job can be developed. When Charlie Swab first went to work for me, he had no ability as far as surface appearances went, other than that possessed by any other day labourer. But Charlie has an unbeatable mental attitude and a disarming personality that enabled him to win friends among all classes of men. He also had a natural willingness to do more than he was paid for. This quality was so pronounced in him that he actually went out of his way to get into the way of work. He not only went the extra mile, but he added 2 or 3 extra miles and went with a smile upon his face and the right attitude in his heart. He also went in a hurry and came back for more when he had finished any task assigned to him. He took hold on a hard job as eagerly as a hungry man takes on food when it is set before him. Now, what can one do with a man like that, except to give him plenty of rain and let him go as fast as he pleases? That sort of mental attitude inspires confidence. It also attracts opportunities that will run away from the man who carries a frown on his face and a grouch in his heart. I tell you frankly that there is no way to hold back a man with that sort of mental attitude. He writes his own price tag and gets it willingly. If one employer is short-sighted enough to withhold recognition of such a man through adequate compensation, some wiser employer will soon discover him and give him a better job. The law of supply and demand, therefore, steps in and forces the proper reward for such a man. The employer has very little to do with such circumstances. The initiative is entirely in the hands of the employee. Nor is this example of the wisdom of rendering more service than one is paid for applicable only to the relationship of employer and employee. The same rules apply with equal definiteness to professional men. In fact, to all who make their living by serving others. The grocer, who tilts the scales in favour of the customer when he is weighing a pound of sugar, is wiser, by far, than the grocer who waters his sugar to make it weigh more. The merchant who gives the customer the odd half cent in making change, instead of taking it himself, is wiser by far than the merchant who refuses to do this. I have known merchants to lose the business of customers worth hundreds of dollars a year by this pinch penny habit that some merchants have of taking the odd half cent in making change. I once knew a little merchant who went up and down the Monongahela Valley near Pittsburgh, peddling his merchandise from a pack that he carried on his back. I have heard it said that the pack weighed more than the man who carried it. When this merchant made a sale, he usually threw in some extra article that had not been paid for as an expression of his gratitude for the patronage given him. Oh, the gift did not amount to much as far as its momentary value was concerned, but he made it with such a pleasant mental attitude that the customer always spoke of the courtesy to all the neighbours, thereby giving the merchant free publicity he could not have purchased with money alone. In a little while this merchant disappeared from his established route. His customers began to make inquiries as to what had happened to him. The inquiries were prompted by a genuine affection for the little man with the big pack, as they called him. Within a few months the little man showed up again. This time he came without his big pack. He came to tell all his customers that he had opened a store of his own in Pittsburgh. That store is now one of the largest and most prosperous in the city. It is known as the Horn Department Store, founded and owned by the little man with the big pack. And one might add, the little man with the big heart and the wise brain. We look at men who have arrived and say, how fortunate or how lucky. All too often we fail to inquire into the source of their luck, for if we did, we might learn that their luck consisted of their habit of rendering more service and better service than they were paid for, as in the case of the little man with the big pack. Word has reached my ears many times that Charlie Swab got a favourable break because old man Carnegie took a fancy to him and pushed him up front ahead of all the others. The truth is that Charlie pushed himself up front. All I had to do in a matter was to keep out of the way and let him go. Any favourable break that he received, he created for himself through his own initiative. When you describe this principle in the philosophy of individual achievement, be sure to emphasise what I have told you about it, because it is the one safe and sure rule through which anyone may influence the wheel of life, so it will yield benefits that will more than offset any misfortunes it may bring. When you take the philosophy to the world, be sure to tell the people how to use this principle of doing more than they are paid for as a definite means of making themselves indispensable to those whom they serve. Be sure also to explain that this is the success rule through which the law of compensation can be deliberately put into operation in one's behalf. I have always thought it was a great tragedy that Emerson did not explain more clearly in his essay on compensation that the habit of rendering more service and better service than one is paid for has the effect of placing the law of compensation back of one's efforts. Hill. Do you know of other men, besides yourself, who deliberately and with purpose, aforethought, follow the habit of doing more than they are paid for, who have not found the habit beneficial? Carnegie. I know of no successful man in any calling or business who does not follow this habit either consciously or unconsciously. Study any successful man, regardless of his vocation, and you will learn quickly enough that he does not work by the clock. If you study carefully those who let their picks hang in the air the moment the whistle blows for quitting time, you will learn that they are making nothing but a bare living. Find me one person who is an exception to this rule, and I'll give you a cheque for $1,000 on the spot, provided that this man will permit me to have a photograph of himself. If any such man exists, he is a rare specimen, and I wish to preserve his picture for the museum so all may see the man who successfully defied nature's laws. Successful men are not looking for short hours and easy jobs, for if they are truly successful, they know that no such circumstance exists. Successful men are always looking for ways to lengthen instead of shortening the working days. Hill, have you always followed the habit of doing more than you were paid for, Mr. Carnegie? Carnegie, if I had not done so, you would not be here seeking to learn the rules of successful achievement, for I would still be working as a day labourer right where I began. If you ask me which of the 17 principles of achievement has aided me most, I think I will be compelled to say it was going the extra mile. However, you must not reach the conclusion that this principle alone can be depended upon for success. There are 16 other success principles, some combination of which must be used by all who achieve outstanding and enduring success. Now is an appropriate time to call your attention to the importance of combining definiteness of purpose with the habit of going the extra mile. In going that extra mile, one should have a definite, final destination in view, and I see no reason why one should not render more service than he is paid for as a deliberate means of influencing the wheel of life in the attainment of a definite goal. What if one does follow this habit as a matter of expediency? It is every man's privilege to promote himself in every legitimate way possible, and especially is it his privilege to advance himself through methods which satisfy and benefit others. As I have stated before, the habit of rendering more service than one is paid for is one habit against which no opposition can be legitimately offered. It is a habit which anyone may exercise on his own initiative without the necessity of asking permission to do so. No purchaser of services will object if the seller delivers more than he promises, and surely no purchaser of services will object if the seller delivers the services with a friendly, pleasing mental attitude. These are privileges within the rights of the seller. Fortunately, we live in a country whose founders wisely preserved for every man the right to exercise his own initiative through all forms of useful service. This privilege, together with the abundance of wealth and opportunity with which we are surrounded in this country, makes it difficult for any man to complain of not having had a chance. Here we may create opportunities for ourselves. This still is a comparatively new country. Its future development offers every man an opportunity to exercise both his initiative and his imagination in rendering needed service. Hill, what about the man whose lack of education forces him to accept only such opportunities as are available to common labourers who work with their hands? Would you say that this man has an equal opportunity with those who have educated themselves? Carnegie, I'm very glad you asked that question, because I wish to set you right on a common mistake that people make in connection with this question of education. First, let me explain that the word educate means something entirely different from that which many believe it to mean. An educated man is one who has taken possession of his own mind and has so developed it through organised thought that it aids him efficiently in the solution of his daily problems in the business of living. Some people believe that education consists of the acquisition of knowledge, but in a truer sense, it means that one has learned how to use knowledge. I know many men who are walking encyclopedias of knowledge, but make such poor use of it that they cannot earn a living. Another mistake that many people make is that of believing that schooling and education are synonymous. I think that's what that says. Are synonymous terms. Schooling may enable a man to acquire much knowledge and assemble many useful facts, but schooling alone does not necessarily make a man educated. Education is self-acquired, and it comes through development and use of the mind, and in no other way. Take Thomas A. Edison, for example. His entire schooling was a little more than 3 months, and it was not the most efficient of schooling at that. His real schooling came from the great school of experience, from which he learned how to take possession of his own mind and to use it. Through this use, he became one of the best educated men in our times. Such technical knowledge as he needed in the business of inventing, he acquired from other men through application of the mastermind principle. In his work, he requires knowledge of chemistry, physics, mathematics, and a great variety of other scientific subjects, none of which he personally understands. But since he is educated, he knows how and where to procure knowledge on these and all other subjects, which is essential in his work. So, disabuse your mind of the belief that knowledge of itself is education. The man who knows where and how to procure the knowledge he needs, when he needs it, is much more a man of education than the man who has the knowledge but does not know what to do with it. Now, there is another angle in connection with this old time-worn alibi through which men explain away their failure by claiming they have had no opportunity to acquire education. It is the fact that schooling is free in this country, and it is so abundantly provided that any man can go to school at night if he really wishes to do so. We also have correspondence schools through which men may acquire knowledge on almost any subject and for a very small price. I have but little patience with those who claim that they have not succeeded because they lack schooling, because I know that any man who really wants schooling can acquire it. The fallacy of this no schooling alibi in most instances is that it is used as an apology for plain laziness or lack of ambition. I had but little schooling, and I began my career on exactly the same basis that any other working man begins. I had no pull, no extra favours, no rich uncle to help me along, and no one to inspire me to promote myself into a more favourable economic status in life. The idea of doing so was entirely my own. Moreover, I found the task to be comparatively easy. It consisted mainly of my taking possession of my own mind and using it with definiteness of purpose. I did not like poverty, therefore I refused to remain under it. My own mental attitude on this subject was the determining factor that helped me to force poverty to give place to riches. I can truthfully tell you that of all the thousands of working men who have been employed by me, I do not know of one person who could not have equalled, if not excelled me, if he had wanted to do so. Hill, your analysis of the subject of education is both interesting and revealing, Mr. Carnegie, and you may rest assured I will include it in the philosophy of achievement, because I feel sure that there are many others who have the wrong conception of the relationship between schooling and education. If I understand you correctly, you believe the better part of one's education comes from doing, and not merely from the acquisition of knowledge. Carnegie, that is exactly correct. I have men working for me who have college degrees, but many of them found their college training only incidental to their success. Those who combine college training with practical experience soon become educated in a practical sense, provided they do not lean too heavily upon their academic degrees as a means of minimising the importance of practical experience. Right here is an appropriate place to tell you that the college graduates whom I have employed, who develop the habit of rendering more service than they are paid for, usually advance themselves to more responsible and better paying positions very quickly, while those who neglect or refuse to adopt this principle make no progress than the average man without college training. Hill, do you mean that college training is worth relatively less than the habit of doing more than one is paid for? Carnegie, yes, you might put it that way, but I have observed that men with college training who follow the habit of doing more than they are paid for, combining their college training with the advantages they gain from this habit, get ahead much more rapidly than men who do more than they are paid for but have no college training. From this, I have reached the conclusion that there is a certain amount of thought discipline that a man gets from college training, which men without this training do not generally possess. Hill, are a majority of the members of your mastermind group men with college training, Mr. Carnegie? Carnegie, about 2/3 of them are without college training, and I might add that the one who has been of greatest service to me, weighing everything they have all done, did not finish his common school training. It may be interesting also to know that his voluntary habit of rendering more service than he was paid for was the quality which made him of greatest value to me. I say this because his example seemed to set the pace for other members of my mastermind group. Moreover, his attitude on this subject spread to the rank and file of our workers, many of whom caught his spirit, practised it, and thereby promoted themselves into better paying and more responsible positions with the company. Hill, have you any definite method by which the endeavour to inform all your men of the advantages they may gain by rendering more service than they are paid for? Carnegie, we have no direct method of doing this, although the news has been passed along by the grapevine route that the men who promote themselves to better positions follow the habit of doing more than they are paid for. I have often thought we should have gone much further by some form of more direct approach by which our men would have been taught the benefits of rendering this sort of service. But we would have done so, and we would have done so we had not feared our efforts would have been misconstrued as an attempt on our part to get more work from our men without paying for it. You see, most working men are sceptical and suspicious of all efforts on the part of an employer to influence them to improve themselves. Perhaps some smarter man than I will find a way through which employers may gain the confidence of their employees and convince them of the benefits to employer and employee alike of the habit of rendering more service than the wage scale calls for. Of course, the rule must work both ways, and it will where an employee understands this principle and applies it deliberately. The matter is in the hands of the employee entirely. There is something he can do on his own initiative without consulting the employer. The wiser employees discover and apply this principle voluntarily. Okay. It's a bit dark in here. I think it has been the whole time. Okay, I haven't looked up. Let me just have a quick break. This is a long chapter, but I'd like to get it done. How long is this chapter? This chapter's really long. Okay. It's cool, we've come a long way. On page 113. There is not a man in my mastermind group who did not voluntarily promote himself to that position through the habit of doing more than was expected of him. I tell you frankly that the man who follows this habit voluntarily soon makes himself indispensable and thereby sets his own wages and chooses his own job. There is nothing an employer can do but cooperate with a man who has the sound judgment to do more than he is paid for. Hill, but aren't there some employers who selfishly refuse to recognise and reward an employee for the habit of doing more than he is paid for? Carnegie, undoubtedly, there are some employers who are short-sighted enough to withhold reward from a man of this type, but you must remember that the man who habitually does more than he is paid for is so rare that there is keen competition among employers for his services. If a man has a sound judgment to understand the advantages of doing more than he is paid for, he generally has sense enough also to know that all employers are seeking this sort of help, and even those who do not know this will, sooner or later, come to the attention of an employer who is looking for that sort of service, even though they do not deliberately endeavour to promote themselves. Every man gravitates to where he belongs in life, just as surely as water seeks and finds its level. Charlie Swab, for example, did not seek me out, as far as I know, and say, "See here, I am doing more than I am paid for." I made the discovery in my own way because I was searching for that sort of mental attitude. No employer can successfully conduct an industry of the size of ours without the aid of a large number of men who put heart, soul, and all the ability they have into their jobs. Therefore, I keep a close lookout at all times for this type of man, and when I find one, I single him out for close observation to make sure that he follows the habit consistently. The truth is that all successful employers do the same thing. That is one reason why they are successful. Whether a man occupies the position of employer or employee, the space he occupies in the world is measured precisely by the quality and the quantity of the service he renders, plus the mental attitude in which he relates himself to other people. Emerson said, "Do the thing and you shall have the power." He never expressed a more truthful thought than this. Moreover, it applies to every calling and to every human relationship. Men who gain and hold power do so by making themselves useful to others. All this talk about men holding fat jobs through Paul is nonsense. A man may procure a good job through Paul, but take my word for it when I tell you that if he remains in the job, he will do so through push, and the more of it he puts into the job, the higher he will rise. I have known of a few young men who were placed in positions beyond their earned merits and abilities through the influence of relatives or others, but seldom have I known of one of them making the fullest use of this unearned advantage, and such exceptions as I have known were due to their having acquired the habit of putting into their jobs more than they tried to take out. Hill, what about the man who does not work for wages? The small merchant, or the doctor or lawyer? How can they promote themselves by rendering more services than they are paid for? Carnegie, the rule applies to them the same as to the man who works for wages. As a matter of fact, those who fail to render such service remain small, and often they fail completely. There is a factor in a successful man's life known as goodwill, without which no man can achieve noteworthy success in any calling. The finest of all methods of building goodwill is that of rendering more service and better service than that which is expected. The man who does this, in the right sort of mental attitude, is sure to make friends who will continue to patronise him out of choice. Moreover, his patrons will tell their friends about him, thereby putting the law of increasing returns into operation in his behalf. The merchant may not be always in a position to put more merchandise in a package than the customer pays for, but he can wrap courteous service in the package and thereby build friendships that ensure him continuous patronage. The doctor, lawyer, or other type of of professional man may have no more ability in connection with his profession than his competitors possess, but he can master and apply the qualities of attractive personality and thereby build goodwill that binds his patrons to him. I have heard that this quality of personality is the determining factor which influences a majority of the people who seek the services of either a lawyer or a doctor. Most people would employ either a doctor or a lawyer, do so on the recommendations of an acquaintance, and the first thing they ask is not how much professional ability has he, but what sort of a man is he. I have heard it said too that 9/10 of those who buy life insurance policies never take the trouble to read their contracts. What they really buy is the personality of the agent who sells the policy. And I heard a very prosperous life insurance agent say that most of his sales were made through friendly introductions made by policyholders to whom he had sold himself. You see, goodwill and confidence are essentials of success in all walks of life. Without these, one is forever confined to mediocrity. There is no better way of building these relationships than that of rendering more service and better service than that which is customary. This is one method of self-advancement which one may exercise on his own initiative, and generally speaking, it is a form of service that can be rendered during odd time which would be otherwise wasted. Mr. Carnegie, is your analysis of the habit of doing more than one is paid for based entirely upon your personal experience and your observation of the experience of others? Carnegie, not entirely. I have found supporting evidence of the soundness of this principle in nature. In fact, it appears that nature herself applies this principle. Let me give you a few illustrations of what I mean. First, we can see nature going the extra mile by creating an overabundance of blooms on the fruit trees. Here nature makes allowance for the emergencies of wind and storm, through which many of the blooms will be destroyed. Observe with what careful planning she provides for the fertilisation of the blooms by painting them with attractive colours and filling them with sweet perfumes and nectar which attract the attention of the bees, whose service are needed to carry the fertilising pollen from flower to flower. All this preparatory work is done by nature in advance of the benefits which result in the form of the fruit that the flowers are to produce. Notice in this elaborate setup, which nature has prepared to attract the bees, how clearly she has arranged her plan so that the bees must render useful service before they can collect their pay. Without this exchange of values between the flowers and the bees, neither could exist. Thus we see here the perfect illustration of the soundness of the principle of doing more than one is paid for as a means of producing fruit and perpetuating the life of the bees. Hill, I have never thought of nature as a teacher of the principle of doing more than is paid for, but I can see a perfect working example of this principle in the illustration you have given. Does nature use the same principle in other ways, Mr. Carnegie? Carnegie, indeed she does. Nature goes the extra mile in everything she does. When she creates frogs in the ponds, she does not stop by producing the minimum number needed to perpetuate the species, but she arranges for an overproduction sufficient to provide for all emergencies. She does the same with the fish in the sea and the birds of the air, and with every form of vegetation that grows from the soil. Everywhere one looks, one may see nature going the extra mile, through a system of production that provides for every circumstance essential for the perpetuation of her species. In her clever scheme for the perpetuation of life, she makes use of two natural laws with which every person should be familiar: the law of compensation and the law of increasing returns. Let us take farming as an example of how cleverly nature uses these two laws. You are reared on a farm. Therefore, you will readily grasp and understand the illustration I have in mind. In order to produce the food he needs, the farmer must adapt himself to the working principle of both the law of compensation and the law of increasing returns. He must also apply the principle of going the extra mile, whether he recognises the full significance of what he does or not. First, the farmer must clear the soil of trees and shrubs. Next, he must plough the soil and give it extra fertilisation if needed. Then he must plant the soil with seed. He must mix intelligence with this labour by planting the seed at the right season of the year. After these steps have been taken, the farmer has gone as far as he can go in connection with the production of food from soil. Here he must stop and wait for nature and time to do their work through germination and growth of the seed that produces the crop. Up to this point, the farmer receives nothing for his labour, having literally done more than he was paid for. If the farmer has performed his part of the labour intelligently, nature will reward him through the law of compensation and the law of increasing returns by giving back to him the seed he planted in the ground, plus a margin of many times the amount of seed he planted, as his reward for having done more than he was temporarily paid for. Hill, what a clever alliance between the farmer and nature. Without this exchange of favours, man, under our present form of civilization, could not perpetuate himself, could he? Carnegie, now you have the idea. Nature provides for the perpetuation of all her living creatures of lower intelligence through a system of food production which we call wild growth, but study her system carefully, as in the example of the bee, and observe how inexorably she forces every living thing to labour in order to live, and notice particularly that the labour must be delivered before the benefits are received. Notice too that nature provides food for man, the same as she does for living things of a lower intelligence, through her system of wild growth. As long as man remains a child of the jungle, as long as man remains child of the jungle, but she changes her system the moment man leaves the jungle life and becomes a part of civilization, and forces him to earn his right to the privilege of higher intelligence by producing his own food from the soil. Hill, how perfectly simple are nature's plans once we follow through, as you have done, and observe with what regularity nature applies principles you have described. I see now exactly what you mean by your reference to the law of compensation. It appears that nature neither permits any living thing to get something for nothing, nor allows any form of labour to be done without adequate reward. Moreover, nature tends to protect her creatures against destructive forces. Note how she heals man's wounds and restores the skin that is cut or torn away. Observe how the injured tree heals over and seals the scar against further destruction. Carnegie, you are beginning to discover where I get my authority for the strong emphasis I have placed on the habit of going the extra mile. I get it from a source which cannot be questioned, no less an authority, in fact, than that which unfolds to us the plan by which all life on earth is perpetuated. You see, therefore, why I said that the laws, which make the principle of doing more than one is paid for, operative and essential to all who achieve outstanding success, are not man-made laws. I concede the truth of your statement that nature's plans, which we are here discussing, are simple as far as the effects of these plans are concerned, but I would hardly apply the word simple as an explanation of the cause back of the plans. That cause is as profound and imponderable as are all other natural laws through which this little world and the universe of which it is an infinitesimal part, are harmoniously related and maintained with orderliness throughout time and space. Here we must be content to observe and comply with effects even though we do not understand the cause of those effects. And I totally lost it there. Ooh, look at it right now. It's getting bright. Okay, hard to comprehend. Or hard to put into words. Okay. Of one thing we can, however, be very sure. I love it how it changes the flow. It looks like I've got my shadow of my hair. It looks like there's a bit of hair there. I love how it kind of changes. It's kind of like I even stumble when I'm reading it because I'm trying to comprehend at the same time. So let's carry on. Of one thing we can, however, be very sure, and it is the fact that nature has provided definite laws to which man can adapt himself profitably in connection with the business of living, without the necessity of inquiring into the broader purpose of those laws. Two of these are the law of compensation and the law of increasing returns, both of which provide a sound reason why we should render more, which provide a sound. I'm just rereading that, okay. Why we should render more service than we are paid for. We may observe this reason in the effects of these laws as nature herself applies them for the perpetuation of the species of living things. Hill, from your description of the law of compensation, I reached the conclusion that the term doing more than is paid for is somewhat a misnomer, in that is impossible in the broader meaning of this term. For one to do more than he has paid for. Is that your understanding, Mr. Carnegie? I need to reread that to get my understanding. I'm not stopping this chapter. I've tried to get this one out lots of times. Let's carry on. From your description of the law of compensation, I reached the conclusion that the term doing more than is paid for is somewhat a misnomer, in that is impossible in the broader meaning of this term, for one to do more than he is paid for. Is that your understanding, Mr. Carnegie? Carnegie, I was waiting to see if you would grasp this point without my calling it to your attention. You are correct. All forms of constructive labour are rewarded, in one way or another, and in the broader sense, there really is no such possibility as that of doing more than one is paid for. Moreover, I wish to call attention to the great variety of ways in which man is compensated for going the extra mile. Living creatures of a lower order than man, and even man himself, where he lives in the jungle, as one of nature's responsibilities, receive nothing for their labour except food and clothing necessary for existence. But man has been elevated to a position of power from which he commands and receives the bounties of the earth in whatever forms and quantity he desires. For he has learned the art of translating thought into material things. Let us state the case this way. Man is the Creator's greatest handiwork and has been given the privilege of self-determination. The very fact that man has control over his own thought power is a profoundly significant fact. It connotes the power of thought to be man's greatest asset. The fact that thought is a man's gateway of voluntary approach to the source of infinite intelligence is definite evidence of its importance. Now let us see what specific benefits are available to man through his exalted powers of thought and speech, which compensate him for going the extra mile. The more useful of these compensating advantages are these. Some advantages of doing more than one is paid for. Number 1. The habit of going the extra mile gives one the benefit of the law of increasing returns in a variety of ways, too numerous to be described here. Number 2. This habit places one in a position to benefit by the law of compensation, through which no act or deed will or can be expressed without an equivalent response, after its own nature. Number 3, it gives one the benefit of growth through resistance and use, thereby leading to mental development and increased skill in the use of the body. It is a well-known fact that both body and mind attain efficiency and skill through systematic discipline and use, which call for the rendering of service that temporarily is not paid for. Number 4, the habit develops the important factor of initiative, without which no individual ever rises above mediocrity in any calling. Number 5, it develops self-reliance, which is likewise an essential in all forms of personal achievement. Number 6, it enables an individual to profit by the law of contrast, since obviously a majority of the people do not follow the habit of doing more than they are paid for. On the contrary, they endeavour to get by with a minimum amount of service. Number 7, it helps one to master the habit of drifting aimlessly, thereby checking the habit which stands at the head of the major causes of failure. Number 8, it definitely aids in development of the habit of definiteness of purpose, which is the first principle of individual achievement. Number 9, it tends strongly to aid in the development of attractiveness of personality, thereby leading to the means by which one may relate himself to others so as to gain their friendly cooperation. Number 10, it often gives an individual a preferred position of relationship with others through which he may become indispensable, thereby fixing his own price on his services. Number 11, it ensures continuous employment, thereby serving as insurance against wants in connection with the necessities of life. Number 12, it is the greatest of all the known methods by which the man who works for wages may promote himself to higher positions and better wages, and serves as a practical means by which a man may attain the position of ownership of a business or industry. Number 13, it develops alertness of the imagination, the faculty through which one may create practical plans for the attainment of one's aims and purposes in any calling. Number 14, it develops a positive mental attitude, which is one of the more important qualities that are essential in all human relationships. Number 15, it serves to build the confidence of others in one's integrity and general ability, which is an indispensable essential for noteworthy achievement in every calling. And number 16, finally, it is a habit which one may adopt and follow on his own initiative without being under the necessity of asking the permission of anyone to do so. Compare these 16 definite advantages that are available to man in return for doing more than he is paid for, with the one sole benefit, that of acquiring food necessary for existence, that is available to the other creatures of the earth through the same habit, and you will be forced to the conclusion that overwhelmingly the greater number of benefits enjoyed by man serve as adequate compensation for his development and use of this habit. This comparison substantiates your statement that it is an impossibility for one to do more than one is paid for, and for the very obvious reason that in the mere act of doing that which is constructive, one acquires power that can be converted into one's desires. This analysis gives greater meaning to Emerson's statement, "Do the thing and you should have the power." This is the idea you should emphasise throughout the philosophy of individual achievement. No one who follows this analysis carefully can help discovering the truth that it is impossible for one to do more than one is paid for. The pay consists in the self-discipline and the self-development one attains through the rendering of service, as well as in the material effects of the service in the form of economic compensation. Hill, your analysis of the habit of doing more than one is paid for suggests that this habit is one of the musts of the philosophy of individual achievement. Will you describe some of the definite circumstances in your own business experience through which you have profited by the habit, Mr. Carnegie? Carnegie, you have given me a big order. First, let me give you a blanket answer by saying that all the material riches I possess and every business advantage I enjoy might be attributable to my having followed this habit, but I will give you one specific example of an experience which gave me one of the greatest opportunities to promote myself that I ever enjoyed. I mention this particular experience because it was one of the most dramatic of my life, and I might add that it carried with it one of the greatest risks that I ever assumed in order to go the extra mile. The risk was of that type which one should never assume unless he knows he is making the right move, and even then it is a sort of risk which might be fatal to one's opportunities for self-promotion under most circumstances. When I was a very young lad, I studied telegraphy at night and learned to operate a telegraph key efficiently. I was not paid to do this, nor did anyone tell me to do it. I was rewarded for my labour, however, by attracting the attention of Thomas Scott, Division Superintendent of the Pennsylvania Railroad in Pittsburgh, who gave me the position as his private operator and clerk. One morning, I arrived at the office ahead of everyone else and discovered that a bad train wreck had tied up the line and the whole division was in a jam. The dispatcher was frantically calling Mr. Scott's office when I walked in, so I took the key and found out quickly what had happened. I tried to reach Mr. Scott by telephone, but his wife reported that he had left home. So there I was, sitting on top of a veritable volcano that was sure to explode and ruin my chances with the Pennsylvania Railroad forever if I made the wrong move, and it might do the same thing if I made no move at all. I knew precisely what my chief would have done had he been there, and also knew well enough what he might do to me if I assumed the risk of acting for him in such an important emergency. But time was important, so I took the plunge and sent out the train orders in his name that rerouted traffic and untied the traffic snarl. When my chief arrived at the office, he found a written report of what I had done, with my resignation attached to it, on his desk. I had violated one of the strictest rules of the railroad, so I made it easy for my chief to save face with his superiors by placing my own head on the block. After 2 hours later, I received the verdict. My resignation came back to me with the words, "Resignation refused," boldly written across it in the chief's handwriting. He made no further reference to the circumstance until several days later, and even then he brought the subject up, discussed it in his own way, and dismissed it without either reprimanding me or giving me a clean bill of health for my violation of the rules. He simply said, "There are two types of men who never get far in life. One is the type that cannot do what he is told, and the other is the type that can do nothing else." Here the subject was dismissed with an air of finality, which enabled me to determine to which of these types he believed I belonged. It should be the aim of every young man to go beyond the sphere of his immediate instructions and render service that is not required of him, but one should be extremely cautious in assuming such risks beyond the letter of his instructions as I did on this occasion. Above all, he must know that he is making the right move, but even then he may at times run into difficulty. A young man who worked as confidential secretary to a New York broker lost his job by mixing bad judgment with his well-meant exercise of the habit of going beyond the letter of his instructions. His chief went away for a vacation and left him in charge of a certain funds which he had to invest in the stock market. At a definite time, at a definite time and in a definite manner. Instead of following his instructions, he invested the funds in an entirely different manner. The transaction yielded a much greater profit than would have been received had the employer's instructions been carried out, but the employer took the view that the young man's violation of specific instructions clearly marked him as one who lacked sound judgment and reasons that he might violate his instructions again sometime, under circumstances that would be disastrous. The result was a discharge. So I repeat with emphasis, be sure you are right before breaking rules in order to do more than you are paid for. And be sure of your relationship with the man who may swing the axe above your neck for doing so. There is no quality that can take place of sound, well-balanced judgment. Be active, be persistent, be definite, but also be cautious in your judgment. If I had to deal with the same emergency again, I would handle it exactly as I did. The man who cannot deal with emergencies with sound judgment never can become indispensable in any business, as business cannot be operated successfully on unbreakable rules. The rub comes in knowing when to break them. Chapter 5 done. Make yourself indispensable in your job and see how quickly you are pushed out of it into a better one. I think that's an awesome quote to leave on. Next chapter, use organised individual endeavour. Chapter 6. Thank you for bearing with me with that chapter. That was a long one. And it was not the easiest to actually record and get out. So let's leave on this note. Make yourself indispensable in your job and see how quickly you are pushed out of it into a better one. Okay guys, until I see you next time, take care. Much love. Bye for now.